Dear guests, good evening, everyone. I would like to say a few words as the introduction of this tonight's event. My name is Arpad Szabo. I'm the head of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics, Faculty of Architecture. And I will not be the main person of this event tonight. I will just say a very few words. Already at the time of COVID, we at the department initiated a series of scientific lectures, scientific and partially professional lectures called Urban Rendezvous. And of course, recent years it has not been that widely used, but fortunately we are coming back to this format with a guest lecture from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology from South Africa, Dr. Jordaan. I will hand over the word to Valentina Fesenko, a PhD student at our department, who will also say a little bit longer introduction. Now I just would like to greet everyone. I'm happy there are so many people are here, and I would like to also say it loudly that we are making a recording of the event, and if the recording will be really great, then we also would like to, or we might put it to the Urban Rendezvous YouTube channel of the department. So glad so many people are here. I hand the word now over to Valentina for a little bit longer introduction of our guests, and I'm looking forward to the lecture.
Hello, thank you. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Valentina Fesenko, and I'm an architect and PhD DLA student in the urban design department at BME. And currently I'm helping Dr. Georgi Hori, PhD, with the Department Design 1 or Environmental Design subject. So most of the listeners are supposed to be from this course. I can see some of them here, but everyone could join, of course. And we are here to listen to a lecture by Dr. Jordaan, PhD from Cape Peninsula University of Technology. We met at the Moving Boundaries second week's winter school in Italy last December, which was about perception-related studies applied to architecture. And she will be the faculty member in the next edition of this course, which I'm also attending as a student again. And now I would like to introduce June. June Jordaan is a professional architect and senior lecturer in architecture from Cape Town, South Africa. She practiced architecture in Amsterdam, Mauritius, and Cape Town before joining academia full-time in 2012 at Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Her PhD and subsequent research have focused on the application of phenomenology in architecture, with particular focus on architecture as a psychological phenomenon, architectural archetypes, and architecture and the everyday. She furthermore has done research on cinematic placemaking and its depiction of atmospheres and existential lived space, and also on places of witchcraft. She has presented her research in Japan, Hong Kong, Chandigarh, Oxford, Prague, and across South Africa, and now in Budapest. This path has led her to the field of neuroscience as more scientific discipline for interpreting the human experience of architectural and aesthetic phenomena. And after the lecture, we will have time to ask questions, so please listen carefully and prepare your questions. And June, if it's fine, we can start.
Thank you very much, Arpad and Valentina. This is a very big privilege. An honor. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me just share my screen quickly, please. 1 second. This is always the stuff that makes me nervous. Okay. Valentina, is my screen sharing?
Yeah.
Sorry for the the dog.
Yeah, we see.
We see the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is June, as Valentina has introduced me. This lecture will focus on the elusive term place. It will look at its meaning and application in architecture. I want to start this lecture by asking the simple question: what is it about humans that distinguish us from other species? According to Yuval Noah Harari, it is our ability to abstract, to turn phenomena into ideas, thoughts. With these, we can tell stories and cooperate in groups much larger than other mammals. For Ludwig Wittgenstein, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Architects also rely on language, of course. For the interpretation, conceptualization, and representation, we have thoughts and we have ideas. The famous quote goes, "Be careful of your thoughts, for your thoughts become your words. Be careful of your words, for these become your actions. Be careful of your actions, as these become your habits. And be careful of your habits, as these become your character." Thoughts are governed by words. Think about it. Thoughts give shape to our existence, and words give shape to our thoughts. If meaning is the essential burden of language, I would like to argue in this lecture that place is the essential burden of architecture. So how do we organize our thoughts? We have, of course, philosophy. Philosophy is distinguished from other ways of addressing problems by its critical, generally systematic approach and its reliance on rational argument. I would like to argue in this lecture that language in particular and abstraction in general is pivotal, but also to the detriment to architectural placemaking. Firstly, in the way we abstract places to be predominantly visually pleasing, also known as ocularcentrism, and secondly, in the way that theory and abstraction can lead to incongruous and absurd decisions. The position that the dominance of the visual sense compromises placemaking was, of course, pioneered by Finnish architect Juhani Palasma, who argued for a more haptic and embodied conception of place. With contemporary photographic and three-dimensional rendering technology, we not only find fantastical graphics of places, but they often have distinct incongruous characteristics. Architects might, for example, rely on a genius loci produced through the photographer's gaze, and also on a genius loci produced through the absence of people. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard would certainly concur. For him, the world has become Xerox to infinity. He argues that we live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning. These points are reflected in artistic culture, where Damien Hirst, for example, exhibits dissected animals. The gruesomeness of this work is precisely what encourages the viewer to treat them as objects worthy of aesthetic contemplation. This, of course, brings into question the notion of architectural discourse, the language we speak as architects. At worst, our discourse can lead to endless theoretical conjecture and idiosyncratic propositions, free to imagine anything at will with no obligations to address the real-world dimension. Architects can be drawn into endless speculation, often resulting in the most unnatural structures. In the graphic novel Citizens of No Place, the author brings to light these absurdities. Such a way of analyzing and postulating place can be seen to work from the abstract to the concrete. Here one may consider Nietzsche's parable that illustrates that the left hemisphere of the brain, once subservient to the right, has been privileged and cultivated throughout modernity, resulting in a culture of brains that prioritize rationalization and categorization above all else. The idea that the mind resides somewhere in the brain and is perhaps detached from the body altogether is still adhered to by many. Contemporary artists, philosophers, and scientists, however, argue that this bias is grossly outdated. An example of bizarre architecture based solely on abstraction can be found in the infamous House 6 by Peter Eisenman. Suzanne Frank was the client of this house. She explains that as a result of the need to complete the sequence A and B and to read symmetries and etc., diagonal line according to the datum, etc., the main bedroom was actually split into two. This inconvenient element forced us to sleep in different beds, she said, which was not our custom. Here I would like to introduce two concepts, non-places and placelessness. The former identified by anthropologist Mark Auger and the latter by cultural geographer Edward Ralph. Where Mark Auger's non-places refers to autonomous transitional spaces like airports or highways, lacking social connection and identity, placelessness describes environments lacking distinctiveness or attachment, often due to homogenizing forces like globalization. Since the middle of the previous century, modern architecture has been blamed for this. Charles Jenks famously called the destruction of Pret Ego the day modern architecture died. This building serves as a vivid but devastating example of the failures of modernist architecture. Criticism of placeless geography reached its peak in the 70s when Jane Jacobs wrote her famous assault on modernist delusions in The Death and Life of the Great American City. These modernist spaces were seen as homogeneous, Cartesian, undifferentiated, and quantitative before qualitative. So what is place and why is place important? By making reference to French philosopher Bachelard, Yiffy Tuan incorporated the term topophilia into geography. Topophilia means love of place. Bachelard expanded on images and reveries that are prompted by certain spaces, particularly enclosed spaces. He elaborated on a broad range of emotions and experiences between people and places. But long before Tuan philosophers grappled with notions of space and place, Lao Tzu focused on the superiority of the contained, space within, where Plato defined air to be one of the finite tangible elements, and Aristotle conceived of place not as a void, but rather as a vessel. It suffices to say that we all make places. This is part of human nature, spaces that have meaning and significance to us. This is such a moving photographic essay that I found showing children's bedrooms from different countries in the world. This is, of course, an example of placemaking. So what are the best philosophical positions to take on place? We, of course, have so many. We have ontology that looks at being, aesthetics that looks at beauty, ethics that looks at what's right and wrong, epistemology that looks at knowledge, metaphysics that looks at thinking, logic, language. We need all of these, of course, but the position that helps us understand architecture and place as a psychological phenomenon is phenomenology, the interpretive study of human experience. At the end of his grand opus, The Phenomenology of Perception, French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote, "Man is but a network of relationships, and these alone matter to him." Three important thinkers come to mind here. Edmund Husserl, yes. And then, of course, sorry, I'm getting confused here. Three important thinkers come to mind here. Where his student, Edmund Husserl, and then his student, Martin Heidegger, who concentrated on being, integrating consciousness with the body and also with the world. And then, of course, Merleau-Ponty, who focused on perception. Instead of considering the object-subject dichotomy, he speaks of the perceiver and the perceived. Existence is therefore always relational. So how do we clarify and categorize these theories? In an attempt to apply them, how do we do this? For French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, space is not something in itself, but rather something that is produced through a dialectical triad. In this lecture, I am doing the same. From interdisciplinary literature, I have distilled three dimensions that I would like to argue provide us with a phenomenological framework for understanding place. Firstly, we will look at the material aspects of the life world. The life world, or Lebenswelt, a concept by Husserl, refers to the everyday world of lived experiences, encompassing subjective perceptions, social interactions, and cultural contexts, forming the basis of understanding and interpreting reality. We, of course, perceive the material aspects of our life worlds, where perception, relates to the process of interpreting sensory information to understand and interact with the world, shaping our understanding of reality. To articulate the perception of places, Swiss architect Peter Zumthor interprets architectural environments in order to discover their evocative qualities. In his book Atmospheres, he gives an elaborate interpretation of his experience sitting in an arcade on a Sunday morning. Through rich descriptions, he illustrates what moves him. The material aspects that constitute places can be understood as gestalts. Gestalt theory maintains that perception is based on the mind's ordering of patterns and configurations. A box appears as a box, not as a compilation of planes, in the sculptures of Richard Serra, for example, where Thermowals by Peter Zumthor resembles a large porous stone. Gestalt theory can also be referred to in the way places exist in relation to their wider contexts. For some, places are understood as continuations of their material contexts. This approach can, for example, be seen in the way we build in Cape Town's Bo-Kaap, where you can't recognize where new buildings are being built. This is the Cape Malay area, well known for its brightly colored facades. This can, of course, lead to superficial reproductions, which is what we want to avoid. Another approach to placemaking that makes reference to the past is seen in examples that combine new technologies with traditional and historical motifs. In South Africa today, such projects, also known as post-apartheid hybrids, are more or less generic spatially, but have additional layering of local motifs. Here, projects craft tectonic and sculptural elements act as tropes of a formerly denied history. This is, of course, at the bottom our constitutional court, and at the top the Baragana-Guana transport interchange in Soweto, south of Johannesburg. For others, placemaking means a rupture from the past. We live in a world made up of networks, with poles where the networks connect, where they intersect. These poles are no longer countries, but have instead become cities. Even today, when we refer to Moscow or Washington, in reality, we are talking about the United States or Russia. Some cities that assert themselves within the network of global places have in recent years come to rely on an architectural phenomenon referred to as the Bilbao effect. This denotes architectural projects conceptualized to facilitate growth and bring prestige to cities on a global platform. In contrast to open and connected networks of places, American philosopher Carsten Harries argues that we are in constant pursuit to domesticate or tame space. We do so by constructing boundaries and thereby seize place from space, an action that is rooted in our need to control our environment. Control here refers not only to physical control, but also to psychological or existential control. Norberg Schultz also stresses the importance of boundaries and enclosures in the articulation of place. Here, boundaries and enclosures are concrete, tangible things with character and meaning. And inside and outside is characterized by their natural and physical barriers, addressing what for some is the key existential purpose of architecture, the mediation between the inside and the outside. The binary concepts of existential insideness and existential outsideness can be equated with the opposing concepts of the self and the other. This theme was meticulously explored in Der Bau. In this novel, Kafka drew on the notion of the other to illuminate architects' terror of time. The other is a key concept in continental philosophy, which refers to that which is other than the initial concept being considered. We have spaces of otherness all around us. French philosopher Michel Foucault referred to these as heterotopias. I would love to elaborate on these two pictures, but I don't have time. How the interconnectedness of places affect experiences was also explored by the Situationists International Movement and also by American urban planner Kevin Lynch. Both were concerned with understanding psychogeographies. The idea of psychogeography was introduced by Guy Debord, Debord propagated an approach towards understanding geography with an emphasis on curiosity and drifting from one urban space to the next. In contrast, Neuberg-Schultz argues that places require objects of identification and orientation. To gain an existential foothold, he argues that man has to be able to orientate himself, to know where he is, but that he should also be able to identify with his environment, to know he is in a certain place, how he is in a certain place. So this is a very poignant advertising campaign that was done in District 6. It's an area just outside of, on the fringe of Cape Town, that was subject to forced removals during apartheid in the 60s. All the houses were removed, and these people were brought back and photographed where their houses stood, so in their lounge or at the bus stop, etc., to illustrate this notion of a lack of objects of identification and orientation, but that we still have memory and place attachment to places, and especially to the home. For many others, of course, place is space with meaning, and meaning is inextricably linked to language. By making use of tools developed by language, Charles Jenks applies semiology to architecture. For him, the fundamental idea of semiology and meaning in architecture is that any form in the environment or sign in language is motivated or capable of being motivated. The minute a new form is invented, it will acquire inevitably a meaning. The use of metaphors and analogies can be seen in many architectural places. In the design of the Brion Cemetery, for example, Carlos Scarpa consistently made use of a duality of elements to signify the relationships of the Brioni family members. I would like to contest the idea of architecture as science, architecture as semiology, and will instead argue for an expressive grammar of architecture. To do so, I refer to Norwegian architect Thomas Theis Evensen, who was a student of Neuberg-Schultz. In Archetypes in Architecture, he interprets material environments by looking at archetypical experiences that floor, wall, and roof planes evoke. Here, the material aspects of the life world have the ability to carry both symbolic meanings and have existential expressions. This language constitutes a set of archetypes that he calls the grammar of architecture. He argues that form inevitably has expression, that a narrative picture will move the feelings of the beholders, that we instinctively weep with the weeping. As we exist in a three-dimensional environment, his grammar consists of the experiential nature of the floor plane, the experiential nature of wall planes, and the experiential nature of roof planes. He starts off by noting that we can bracket different versions of human experience, that we have private experiences, personal and idiosyncratic, that we have collective experiences, but also, and most importantly in his thesis, that we have universal experiences, bodily experiences, subject to gravity, motion, and substance. These experiences can, of course, overlap. Confronted with the stair, one might feel resistance, but knowing the function of where it leads, for instance, to a gallows, for instance, one might feel a sense of reluctance. The body's experience of the floor, wall, and roof plane is determined by the horizontal plane and the vertical axis. The language of verticals and horizontals are part of the natural language of space. There is a tension between the lure of open spaces, endless plains, and spacious skies, and the desire to belong to Earth. Artworks depicting the sublime clearly indicate this terrifying power of horizontals. Caspar David Friedrich's artworks exploited this over and over. We also belong to lightness and darkness. Lightness and darkness, as intangible as they seem, are very much dependent on the material aspects of the life world. Darkness has the ability to render the invisible visible, and to thus ignite our imagination. Zumthor discusses two approaches to light in his architecture. Firstly, to plan the building as a pure mass of shadow, and then afterwards to add light as if you are hollowing out a darkness. Secondly, to go about lighting materials and surfaces systematically. He chooses materials by virtue of their ability to reflect light. Inseparable from light and dark is the language of inside and outside. Our experiences of the inside and the outside can be explored through the meanings of openings, windows and doors. Fine arts become illustrative to the different existential expressions openings can provide. Many Dutch painters, such as Johannes Vermeer, established the interior as private and intimate realms, where the windows merely hint at the outside world. This can be contrasted again with my favorite, Caspar David Friedrich's Woman by the Window, where the luminous outside infiltrates the interiors and hints at freedom and the mast of the ship of distant places. You can see the mast there in the background. Another poignant example is Edward Hopper's Rooms by the Sea. The door here allows the openness of light and the ocean to invade the interior, so that it is neither a prison or a cave. In contrast, it becomes valuable to consider the nature of enclosures that resemble the cave. On the one hand, there is something exhilarating but also inhumane about an architecture that denies us the psychological shelter furnished by sound walls, about glass houses that do not preserve at least a trace of a cave. And on the other hand, there is something equally inhumane about architecture that denies us a strong sense of the outside. But place cannot be understood as a mere material object, but should also be understood in terms of dynamic human interactions and interrelations. For Olafur Eliasson, space is time, space without time is a picture. And for Bernard Tschumi, there is no architecture without action or without program. Jeremy Till, who wrote an excellent book called Architecture Depends, expresses his concern for what he terms the deluded detachment of architectural teaching. This detachment refers to a literal and symbolic removal and indifference that architecture schools have from the real world. This tendency to discard the real-world lived dimension of place in architectural design is strengthened in the way architects generate and represent their designs. Design approaches that rely on seductive imagery has been criticized by many to neglect our embodiment of places through the imposition of ideology and the commodification of visually seductive design. Two-dimensional drawings, the plan, the section, the elevation, are flat generators and often neglect the lived and experienced dimension of places. The plan depends on an unattainable God's eye view that humans can never experience. Interesting plans can easily be turned into uninteresting figures, where interesting sections can result in a lack of content, a positive trait that is full of possibilities. This implies an understanding of place that is not in a state of being, but rather in a state of becoming. I like the idea of place as a noun, not as a verb, sorry, not as a noun. The world or places within it cannot be considered in isolation, but always exists in relation to the living, moving, and perceiving body. To say places are not static is to say that places are contingent. Jeremy Till elaborates in his book Architecture Depends on this. So on what is place contingent? The list is infinite. I've just added some here: politics, economics, norms, fashion, global events, cultures. An apt example here is the Torre de David in Caracas, Venezuela, where photojournalist Iwan Baan recently did a photographic essay. It challenges the tradition of depicting buildings as mute, static, and uninhabited objects. This is of course the infamous abandoned and reappropriated skyscraper in Caracas. So what do we do to control these contingencies? What do we do to tame the chaos? Do we as placemakers have agency to order chaos? Or is this just a semblance of order? This image, incidentally, is of the famous grid in the jungle, Oscar Niemeyer's Brasilia. Ordering place could be seen as a ruthless editing of contingencies. Here we see two drawings of Rome. The first image is Piranesi's etching. The drawing almost overwhelms one in its inclusion of low life, weather, fragments, mess, lovers kissing, broken roads, etc. In contrast, the second image is an interpretation of the same locale by an architect. Here, the entire site seems to be sanitized. A selected few lines are seen that link up isolated buildings. Here, order has been imposed and all real-world contingencies have been eliminated. Sanitization and order has always gone together. This point is seen in the transformation of the once clean and ordered housing quarter developed by Le Corbusier in Pessac. Ironically, it was the site to which Le Corbusier was traveling when making his observations of the filthy Bordeaux station. This development was designed as a pure, ordered and clean place. 35 years after its initial design, Pessac had transformed. Le Corbusier produced a kind of architecture that lent itself to conversion and sculptural ornamentation. But what did the occupants add? They added their needs. Embracing contingency means that the architecture and certainly the activity of placemaking is dependent on others at every stage from inception to occupation. The artwork Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson makes the futility of the ridding of contingencies apparent. It comprises a spiral of rocks emerging from a salt lake in Utah. The result is at the same time natural and artificial, of the land and of the water, stable and decaying, emerging from the lake, returning to the lake, and so on. No sense in wondering about classification and categorization, as there are none. Dutch architect John Houbraken also stresses the inseparable coexistence between the physical environment and people. He introduces the notion of fields as autonomous entities. An example that embraces fields and contingencies is the Quinta Monroy housing scheme in Chile by the Chilean architect Elemental, Alejandro Aravena. The premise here is that a basic starter unit or shell is provided from which the inhabitants of the house can incrementally expand. Another example that embraces contingency is the medical student residence at the Catholic University of Louvain by Lucien Kroll. Here, architecture is not fixed and controlling, but instead an open framework that can accommodate multiple actions over time. A recently published graphically manipulated photo is a telling artwork showing us how vandalizing a classic exposes the pressure of perfection of the modern project, and more disturbingly, exposes the hypocrisy of today's modernists. It shows how Villa Savoy, a modernist icon of function and utilitarianism, is treated as a precious object, and this as a result of extensive reconstruction and restoration since the 1960s. So here we need to consider the dimension of time. Carsten Harries argues that architects build in what he calls the terror of time. Nietzsche speaks of a spirit of revenge, defined as the will's ill will against time, as the deepest source of self-alienation. As a result, he argues, man finds it all the more difficult to interpret nature as home and makes it his problem to conquer the terror of time through building. The story of the Tower of Babel signifies the archetypical structure raised by pride to guide against dispersal threatened by time. The tower testifies to man's power, but also to his impotence and terror of time. Similar architectural gestures abound today. In the annual Tribute to Light on the site of the fallen Twin Towers in New York City, for example, 2 beacons of light are called phantom towers, intended to symbolically recreate and fill the image of the fallen towers, ghost limbs. This phenomenon can clearly be seen in the way architects represent their designs, in drawing and particularly in photography. This can be seen in photographs of Le Corbusier's buildings that were consciously manipulated to banish normal inhabitation. A picture of the kitchen of Villa Savoy, for example, shows it with milk and a fish. You know the scene is not real because who in France drinks tea with fish? Frank Lloyd Wright was also impressed by the Japanese house as a supreme study in elimination, not only of dirt, but the elimination of the insignificant. But according to Harries, the beauty that is found in the inorganic belongs to the spirit and not to the body. Places that exemplify the sublime, in other words, are places that are bound to time. The sublime is something that is not opposed to beauty, but is a quality at a higher order of beauty. It is a quality that combines the contrasting experiences of horror and harmony. These experiences simultaneously overwhelm and frighten us. The sublime experience, according to Kant, entails a conflict of the faculties of imagination and reason, whereas beauty entails a harmonious state between imagination and reason. Places that are in ruin certainly make us aware of the temporal nature of our existence. Such places have in recent years received a great deal of attention in the arts. The first decade of the 21st century has seen what appears to be a distinct flourishing of images of decay. Ruins are the most obvious counter-image to architecture that seeks to defeat the terror of time. And they are often so beautiful. If we look at such ruinous landscapes through the eyes of artists, we may find new interpretations that not merely remind us of the inevitable demise of all that is material, but interpretations that provide insight into the making of places with qualities of the sublime. Places in ruination can certainly be touchstones for design. Italian painter De Chirico read Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy and was impressed by the philosopher's dream inspiration for artists. In turn, the pictorial places in De Chirico's work had an immediate impact on both the graphic and material places designed by Italian architect Aldo Rossi. The loneliness and implicit silence of De Chirico's paintings, their melancholy and mystery are made concrete in Rossi's Modena Cemetery. South African architect Harvey Fagan's house in Cape Town, called the S, can also be equated with a ruin. Its overgrown garden has a sense of abandonment, and the black smoke stain above the hearth speaks of human lives and the passage of time. Others argue that it is the present, the here and now, that is fundamentally of relevance. What the artist sees, we shall probably never see again, or at least never see in exactly the same way. This may help us to develop attitudes and dispositions that may nurture openness, alertness, curiosity, amusement, and wonder. In considering this presentness, or the world as found, the notion of the everyday provides insight. Embracing the ordinary is to look at the here and the now instead of the there and the then. This message is echoed by the early Stoic philosophers. Seneca, for example, suggests you must dispense with two things. So you must get rid of two things: fear of the future and remembering ancient woes. Artists that have embraced ordinary events in places are manifold. At the forefront of these were the Dutch painters during the Dutch Golden Age. They abandoned conventional themes such as religion, history, and the military, and started celebrating the everyday. This Dutch movement inspired a love for the ordinary that informed artwork a century later. Degas' laundrettes, Cézanne's apples, and Van Gogh's bedroom comes to mind. The Ushant School from New York, including John Sloan and George Bellows, painted urban life. So did Edward Hopper, as did the Camden Town Group in London. Parisians such as Picasso, Braque, and Jean Gris also celebrated the ordinary by food, newspapers, and wine bottles. There has also been a celebration of ordinary places in literature, such as from James Joyce and Marcel Proust. And here we see photography by Robert Dunant. Please excuse my awful pronunciation. Place is a central ontological structure of being in the world as a result of our existence as embodied beings. To illustrate this relationship with the body and its environment, we can look at the Malian toguna, or men's meeting house. As an instrument of civil action, these public buildings have low ceilings, hereby making it impossible to stand up and shout. Hereby, spatial elements inform both bodily action and culture, and vice versa, until they become an indistinguishable whole. Here we have to consider the term locale. Locale relates to the material setting for social relations, to the shape of a place within which people conduct their lives as individuals, as men and women, black and white, black or white, gay or straight. This is Bergheim in Berlin. A further example can be found in the Follies of the Parc de la Villette in Paris. According to Tschumi, the architect of the park, the idea was to create non-signifying spaces for activity and interaction, in contrast to the traditional park model of relaxation and indulgence. There has been many criticisms of this park, of course, since its completion. The way people intuitively use urban spaces is also referred to as spontaneous urbanism. Here, the meaning of place can be regarded as fragmented and ambivalent, and any spatial environment creates the possibility for behavior out of the norm. Any behavior can, to a greater or lesser extent, influence the meaning and nature of places. We have many places that derive their meaning from spatial transgression in South Africa. The Voortrekker Monument, top left, for example, in Pretoria, an icon synonymous with the Afrikaner culture and certainly to an extent with apartheid, has in recent years been reappropriated as a music venue. Drawing on the ZEF counterculture movement, the rap-rave group The Antwoord also shoot music videos in places regarded as slums. We can also identify patterns through which people shape their daily activities. Place ballet is the phenomenological term that can provide insight into this material dimension of social activity and interaction. The term was developed by David Seaman, architect from America, academic, in Geography of the Life World, and describes regularity of place founded in habit, routine, and the supportive physical environment. So now we get to the third dimension. This third dimension is concerned with experience through memories, imagination, and dreams, experiences that ultimately reside in the mind. It is less tangible than the other dimensions. For Zumthor, there was a time I experienced architecture without thinking about it. And for Kafka, logic is doubtless unshakable, but it cannot withstand a man who wants to go on living. Our ability to perceive is a key consideration in a phenomenological reading of place. Our perceptions of places are informed by our body's relation to places, but also influenced by our mind's relation to places. Vision has for centuries been regarded as the supreme sense. Our current technological culture can be seen to order and separate the senses even more distinctly and prioritize vision above the rest. To counter such detachment and alienation, Merleau-Ponty argues that our body should be seen as the center of the experiential world. To prioritize these haptic and orienting experiences of places does not mean that we negate the sense of vision, but instead that we integrate it with the other senses. Haptic perception relates to the sense of touch. It is a term used in psychology to describe a holistic way of understanding three-dimensional space. The sense of touch can be exploited in architectural placemaking, as it is fundamentally linked to the way we experience temperatures of places. Zumthor points to the fact that every building has a certain temperature and that materials are conductors of temperature. For him, temperatures are both psychological and physical. He refers to the building of the Swiss pavilion for the Hanover World Fair, indicating that when it was hot outside, it was cool inside the pavilion and vice versa. The light condition of the building mimics the climate and natural light qualities of Switzerland. This ability of architecture to create a sense of relief through temperature can be understood through the transporting function of place. It can thus instill within us desires and dreams to be elsewhere. Various temperatures and haptic experiences are, for example, evoked through the varying hues and reflective qualities of colored lights at Casa Ghilardi by Louis Barragan. Temperatures can also be felt through our confrontations with pictorial places, places depicted in pictures. How cool breezes can be felt in the paintings of Matisse, humidity in the Tahitian landscapes of Gauguin, and moist air in Turner landscapes. If these points are true for artists, they are equally important for architects in the way they dream of places, the way they conceptualize, draw, and anticipate places. Drawings of architects should thus be able to convey the tactility that cannot be articulated with words. The presence, but also the absence of light through darkness and shadows enrich our multi-sensory experiences of places. Shadows give life to objects. Darkness has the ominous ability to render the visible invisible. In The Passenger, for example, a film, 1975, the protagonist is murdered behind the viewer's back as he is watching arbitrary and insignificant incidents of everyday life through the window. Similarly, in Fritz Lang's film M, no violence occurs. There's, for example, the sequence where a little girl is murdered, and all you can see is a ball rolling and then stopping, and a balloon flying off and getting caught in the telephone wires. It is also important to consider how our sense of hearing, our auditory sense, influences and enriches our experiences of places. All places, whether natural or man-made, have characteristic sounds and echoes. Zumthor also stresses the importance of sounds in places. For him, interiors are like large instruments that collect, amplify, and transmit sound where covered with concrete, transmit sound. Sorry. All of these senses, our sense of smell arguably has the strongest ability to evoke memories. The most vivid memories we have of places are often related to their smells. A particular smell makes us unknowingly re-enter space completely forgotten by the retinal memory, and we are enticed to enter a vivid daydream. We are all engaged with memory at any given occasion. Memories affect and determine our experiences of places and occur in various different ways. We can distinguish between three different types of memory, similar to experience: individual memory, social memory, and collective memory. And these make up the spaces of memory. Spaces of memory are often built for the ostensible purpose of preserving memory against forgetting. Here, history becomes something else when you turn it into memory. Where history is an inquiry into the past, memory is a conviction about the past. It could be argued that monuments, films, and books do not begin to atone for what happened to the dead. The dead are not here anymore, but memorials are for us. South Africa has numerous spaces that memorialize the atrocities of apartheid. The Apartheid Museum and the Hector Peterson Museum are both situated in the south of Johannesburg. Hector Peterson Museum is, of course, located on the locale of the June 16th student uprisings that happened in the 60s, and where the famous photo was taken of Hector and his sister, a photo too graphic to add to the presentation. And another project we have also in Soweto is the Walter Sisulu Square, the place where South Africa's Freedom Charter was signed. The architects repetitively made use of the icon of a cross, signifying the right of all in democratic South Africa to vote. These projects have also had a mixed reception. But to draw on memory as a tool for placemaking necessitates us to consider our imaginations and dreams of places. Imagination refers to the mental faculty forming images or concepts of external concepts not present to the senses. Memory, imagination, and dreams are modes of place experiences that are in constant interaction. The architect's work is influenced by memories of many places. They enable us to produce inner images in our minds. Inner images enable us to project our memories onto places and therefore influence the way in which they are experienced. The architecture conceived by artists could be seen as a direct reflection of mental images, memories, and dreams, architecture of the mind. This memorial was designed by Peter Zumthor in collaboration with French artist Louise Bourgeot and acts as a memorial for the 17th century Finnmark witchcraft trials. Zumthor explained that he designed the memory hall with no meaning, no comment, as a semiotic void. Without semiotic noise, it is proposed that the perceptual vacuum is established, a vacuum where memory might surface. There's too much to elaborate on here on this project, so I will unfortunately not elaborate on it now. In the Poetics of Space, Bachelard attempts to articulate such inner primal images that we have. Well-being, writes Bachelard, takes us back to the primitiveness of the refuge. By referring to nests and shells, he characterizes primal images. The question of nesting comes up when one considers how Mrs. Farnsworth fled to a nunnery in Italy, as she was unable to nest in the curtainless floating house designed by Miss van der Rohe in Illinois. The home of Charles and Ray Eames in California, on the other hand, can be seen as a nest. It is no less rational, but nonetheless feathered with human life. Nests can also be found in the pictorial places of Van Gogh. If the phenomenology of nests is the product of the interior architect, the phenomenology of shells is that of the architect. Buildings are nothing if not shells. Carapaces, armor. Buildings are like coral reefs, termite mounds, or caves that create rigid cells to protect soft and vulnerable bodies. The St. Benedict's Chapel, one of the most moving pieces of architecture I've ever been to in Switzerland by Zumthor, is like the interior of a ship's hull, which is also a shell. For Bachelard, empty shells speak of mortality, the body exiting the soul, similar to an office building at night, or an abandoned factory, or an empty church on a Tuesday. Cities of dreams and imagination are beautifully elaborated on in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Here, Marco Polo describes fantastical cities, each representing facets of human experience. Through poetic prose, Calvino explores themes of perception, memory, and imagination. These cities blur boundaries between reality and illusion, inviting readers to ponder the nature of existence and the diversity of human perception. Our memories and primal images of the home also have a significant influence on the way we experience and project ourselves onto places in the world. To better understand our images of the home, Bachelard discusses what he terms the oniric house, the house of the mind. The oniric house is more than a product of dreams. It is also a house we remember. The longing that the oniric house evokes, the heimwee, also reminds us of the transporting function of place, the Fernweh. German has such beautiful words. Entering remembered or imagined places as conceived by architects are real in the sense of the experience and therefore become valuable references for architectural placemaking. Indeed, scientific research has recently shown that mental images occur in the same zones of the brain as visual perceptions. In Hitchcock's Vertigo, we lend our dizziness, and in Crime and Punishment, we lend our waiting. In Stalker, we lend our patience. Both film and architecture are products of an auteur, an artistic creator. This is also something that is contested. To what extent architects attempt to exert order and control in placemaking can be equated to approaches followed by film directors. Hitchcock and Kubrick represent an artistic approach based on meticulous and mathematical planning of films, with sets often constructed to achieve uncompromising artistic control, where Antonio and Tarkovsky planned their work more loosely and based decisions on improvisation and the evocation of the settings themselves. Existential lived space in cinema can evoke varied placial experiences. Note here how Edward Hopper's Railway House has informed the isolation and suspense of Hitchcock's Bates House, the set of Psycho. Placemaking, viewed through phenomenology, perception, dreams, imagination, and memory, unveils the intricate bond between human experience and the built environment. Phenomenology reveals how individuals shape their sense of place. Perception uncovers the link between sensory input and spatial understanding. Dreams and imagination transcend physical limits, shaping our visions for place. These perspectives enhance our understanding of placemaking as a holistic pursuit, enriching lives and shaping collective identity. Thank you very much.
June, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Just absolutely impressive, deeply thoughtful, and actually very important and useful for me personally. So it gives room for many, many thoughts and questions. And I would like to start the questions and answers session with my two very naive questions. The first one just got stuck in my mind when you, in the very beginning, shared the concepts of shelter, vulnerability, and mortality. And I'm just curious how the latter can affect our perception of the space. And
yes, yeah, okay.
Okay, should I ask the second one or?
Yes, you can ask both.
And the second question is more general, more about your background. Apart from phenomenology, you're also interested in neuroscience. And what do you think? Can neuroscience use the same concepts as phenomenology, and how they can work together in applying for architecture, and for what purposes? So how do you see the perfect recipe? That's it.
Okay, so thank you, Valentina. So the idea of shelter and vulnerability really relates to the three archetypes that Thijs Evenson speaks of the experiential nature of the floor plane, the wall plane, and the roof plane. And according to him, that is really all that architecture is. And the different variations of that, what the purpose of that is to create a mediation between the interior and the exterior. And to what extent we feel enclosed, we get a sense of existential insideness, a sense of safety. And to the extent that things are open and connected, we might feel a sense of vulnerability. So this relates to a kind of a primal sense of feeling safe and feeling at home. And that's also why this idea of the home, it's not just a house that we grew up in, but that the home and that place that we felt safe as a child, that oniric house, the house of dreams, is also something that resides within our mind, that we can feel a sense of being at home. But for Thijs Evenson, it is really about the material artifacts and to what extent it mediates insideness versus outsideness. That relationship of the inside and outside will affect to what extent we feel exposed or safe or vulnerable. And then with relation to neuroscience, I'm completely novel at it, but I am extremely positive and optimistic that what neuroscience is doing and in the process of doing, and why we are incorporating neuroscience into architectural discourse, is neuroscience is a science, and it's based on the scientific method. So what it will do is it will be able to quantify qualities of things. It will be able to quantify in terms of our bodies, our physiology, and be able to measure how we respond, how our bodies respond physically, and how we emotionally respond to environments and to phenomena. The reason why phenomenology is so interesting to me is a phenomenon is anything that we can perceive. So jealousy is a phenomenon, for example. Color is a phenomenon. Not all phenomena are of relevance to architects. One might say jealousy, guilt, shame are phenomena, but those are perhaps more for the psychological discourse. But for architecture, a phenomenon that is very elusive and hard to understand is the phenomenon of place, because we cannot see it, we cannot feel it. Well, we can feel it, but it's very difficult to understand. So what these philosophers have done is they have elaborated on it with very sophisticated language. And a lot of the people I refer to in the lecture are also not scientific, they're more poets, like Bachelard and even Ioannis Palasma. They write in very poetic ways, but I find that it's very difficult as an architectural educator to teach students to design places that are meaningful and significant and rich atmospherically by referring to that literature, where I feel the moment we can start incorporating more tangible scientific kind of data into our discourse, we will be able to apply that into our placemaking. So I'm basically saying I'm very optimistic about the field, and I'm very keen to learn. And I think I trust science, and I trust the scientific method. And for me, that is what is very exciting about bringing it into architecture, so that it doesn't sit in the realm of just language, but rather in the realm of science as well, because architecture is essentially the art of construction. It's an art and it is a science.
Wow, thank you very much. Has anyone else have questions?
I have a question. Apologies for my camera not being on, but I found this to be a wildly impressive and hugely interesting presentation. So congratulations and thank you. I have a question around AI, which is, I think, a topic that certainly is not my favorite topic, but one that is a necessity and becoming ever important, even in the context of architecture. And I'd be interested, following your very poetic and elaborate view on architecture, as to your view on the role of AI, both positive and negative, in helping us to reimagine space or understand the experience of space. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, thank you so much, Sophie. It's a hard one because AI is so new and it is moving so fast. It is accelerating, and we are all trying to get on board. I am personally very optimistic about AI, but we can never negate what our wonderful French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger said, the fact that we are embodied biological human beings, and that we, to a large extent still at this point, experience the world with our bodies. We spend a lot of time not engaging with the real world. But I am very optimistic about the kind of research and sophistication that can come out of AI. I'm not 100% sure what that is, and I'm not 100% sure how that will align with these phenomenological topics. But I am somehow optimistic. I'm not 100% sure where it will go. But the intersection of phenomenology and potentially neuroscience with artificial intelligence, I think could possibly yield interesting results. I'm not sure. So it's something to ponder, definitely. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't answer that question really.
No, no, that's really helpful. I mean, I was thinking of in the context of, and I'm thinking about these really beautiful and very interesting kind of AI created images, which are created on the basis of, design me a space that will house 260 people as a result of climate change with low cost accommodation, and must represent either kind of key architectural forms or ideas within architecture, and reimagining spaces in a way that perhaps are freed from the human mind and every
Absolutely.
kind of
I think what it will be able to do, and what it is doing, is to take a lot of complex information and synthesize it really quickly. So that is really like the processing of that is really good. But we also run the risk of having this like visual porn, the stuff I was talking about, where we have seductive imagery that is completely unrealistic, where gravity doesn't exist, or there's always mist and there's always snow in the AI, but it kind of doesn't always acknowledge these real world contingencies, things that impact onto places by how many ever different types of contingencies that we have. But then again, one might start programming that into the AI and see how that resolves. So I think it should be iterative, and it should be something that one needs to critically reflect on. With our students, for example, we do AI up to a point, but then we ask them to resolve the buildings to become real physical buildings. So that can actually stand up and stand the test of time. And I don't know if VR can ever really give us the same experience as walking into Chartres Cathedral, for example, to experience the light, the darkness, the volume, because we have proprioception, we have bodies, and we have senses in which our senses that relate to space, our bodies, and that we navigate with, and we are subject to gravity, and we are vertical beings, and everything to do with AI is really abstracting that.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I had one more question, but I don't want to take anyone else's slot.
No, please go ahead. Sorry.
My question was on the profession itself, and as an educator, I think you can give a prime view of this. I also joined both yourself and Valentina on the Moving Boundaries Italy course, and my background is actually in psychoneurophysiology, and I researched the psychoneurophysiological influence of office-scapes actually on human experience. But one of the things that struck me as a non-architect is the omission of the human body as a central part of architectural training. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, and maybe provide some insights into other areas where architectural training needs to be improved in order to be able to completely absorb the responsibility of architect in planning cities and in designing the way in which we live, essentially.
Yeah, I was a little bit nervous about the lecture, because some of the literature I have is not like the latest literature. And I do think there are definitely architecture schools in the world that prioritize the human experience of place. I mean, for students to be able to go on site visits, to experience places, to interpret them, I think there are concerted efforts being made, but there's always this kind of idea of the ivory tower of education that is removed from reality. And we have to a certain extent, work with hypothetical situations in our education system, as the students are students. But there's very interesting research coming out of Brazil by Solingaros and Mazden, and also, of course, Christopher Alexander. And both of those authors are not actually architects, but mathematicians, and there's a lot been written on this idea of architectural education as a black box and the detachment from real world. And I do think that is why it is so interesting to incorporate different disciplines into our discipline. For example, probably most of the literature I refer to tonight, I came across is from a discipline called human geography and cultural geography. So that is all concerned with place. And so I think one might run the risk of not addressing these issues if one only refers to architectural literature and architectural discourse, but there's so much in other disciplines happening that looks at the experiential nature of places, whether it's offices or cities or whatever. And it's so important to incorporate that into our discourse, such as your discipline, for example. It sounds so niche in that sense. To apply into our discipline. So that is really the pursuit. And the reason I did this research a while ago, was because I found the literature to be very esoteric and hard to understand and hard to apply. And that is often the case with interdisciplinary studies. So I think it's very important to then break it down and to apply it in the studio. I'm also a very big proponent of design build projects for students to go out to build, to experience space one-on-one. I was lucky enough to interview Peter Zumthor. I went to his office and they had one-on-one models. They have one-on-one models and they have spaces drawn up at one-on-one. And so it's really interesting to see how important the body and space is in their offices work, as opposed to just drawing abstract lines on flat pieces of paper.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. I think we have time for the last question, so please go ahead.
I think everybody's tired now. Tired and bored.
Too impressed with the content of your presentation, June.
That's true.
Yeah, actually, it was so comprehensive that it's very hard to ask questions. We had a lot of very interesting thoughts, and I guess for students, it was not that easy to follow. Even for me, it was sometimes not that easy. So really, congratulations! It was great.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I hope it wasn't too convoluted. But thank you very much, Arpad, and thank you for the opportunity.
I would also like to emphasize that it was really impressive and it was a dense and a really inspiring thing. But I think it will need time to really understand fully what you have put together, because you have a big picture and we have so many important impression of it. So I might be happy to see it again and maybe to give you a feedback later on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think Heather has a hand up.
Yeah, Heather.
Hi, June. My comment is literally just picking up two things you just said, and that is that Peter Zumthor insists that every trainee architect he employs is a maker. He says they can knit, they can be a stonemason, they can be anything they like, but they must have some skill in making before he'll take them in. And Krista Alexander's training school at the moment is, again, it's a year with making, actually stonemasonry and laying tiles. And I think, again, what you said about your students going out to do on-site build. And I'm struck by the fact that architects were always makers. They were always very often stonemasons, and they came from the making side. And I think if we could return training to the discipline of design with the discipline of making, we would be able to feel the materials we're using and feel the space we're making. And I think that's a really, I don't know about AI, how that works, but I think the actual tactility and the sensoriumness of being with materials and being with spaces, it goes right back to the making and handling of things.
Absolutely, Heather. That also relates back to that idea of the haptic that I was speaking about.
Yeah.
And that is something that we are subject to. And I think, yeah, the idea of craft and making things with the hand and experiencing the lived world with our bodies is something that we should never forget as architects. We should never get lost in the language and the beautiful pictures.
Yeah. There was a paper I read recently, I can't remember what it was about, who it was now, but she explored empty spaces through dance. And she said, when I'm designing spaces, I think as if I'm dancing through them. And can I dance? Can I put my hands out, my hands up? Can I move my body? And I thought that was really rather wonderful.
Wow. We've done a student project with our students where we take them into the city and they need to identify spaces for dancing or weeping. So places that are private where one could weep and be alone, and places where one might dance. So it's also about placial interpretation and what does the place kind of entice out of the student. Yeah, it's beautiful, Heather.
It's such exciting stuff, and a lot of it's coming from neuroscience, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you had this lecture here.
So thank you,
Valentina.
Thank you, June. It was really great. I also would like to thank everybody who joined.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you for your attendance. Hopefully we will have the recording online not in a few days, maybe in a few weeks.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Bye.